bell of New Canterbury rang with the same practiced certainty it always had. It tolled across the frost-dusted stone and through corridors that smelled of ink, old paper, and lamp oil. It drifted over the quad where students crossed in clusters, collars raised against the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds. It reached the chapel spire, then the dormitory roofs, and finally crested the bare winter trees that stood like quiet witnesses to another academic day. And yet the sound no longer carried the weight it once did. Once it had felt like a summons, an orderly call to the work of the mind and the soul, to theology, truth, and the shaping of men who would carry the word into the empire's far reaches. Now it felt more like a habit, a well-oiled machine, a sound that persisted even when the fire beneath it waned. He sat in his office alone, shoulders slightly hunched, a heavy coat draped across the back of his chair. The room held the familiar scent of his life. Old bindings, dry parchment, candle wax, and the faint sharpness of iron from the radiator that never quite warmed the space the way it should. Shelves bowed under commentaries, histories, and sermons written by men long dead. A narrow window looked out over the quad. Beyond it, winter night was bright and cold. On his desk lay student essays, half-finished arguments, thin paraphrases, and the occasional sincere page that still made him pause. His hand hovered over one paper. The handwriting was neat, the phrasing polished, but the content felt hollow. Words without weight. A student merely making the arguments because they were assigned. No real zeal or devotion buried beneath the long words. Regulus exhaled slowly and leaned back. The chair creaked under the shift. He had been thinking again about the lecture hall, about the glazed eyes, the polite disinterest, about young men who wanted the title of minister, but not the discipline required by Scripture, about Thomas Ellery's face when confronted. Angry, yes, but worse, indifferent. As if the Word of God were an accessory to life rather than the spine of it. Regulus stared at the window, watching students pass beneath bare branches. "What am I to do, Lord?" he whispered. Not for the first time. No answer came. Only the slow tick of the clock on the wall, measuring the march of time as faithfully as a soldier. Not that Regulus expected an audible answer, but some kind of direction would be comforting. Some assurance that he was truly making a difference and not just speaking into the void. A knock sounded at the door. Regulus blinked, straightened, and cleared his throat. "Come in." The door opened and one of the university clerks stepped inside. The man was young, cheeks flushed from the cold, cap in hand. His posture was very careful, as if he had been instructed that this delivery was not to be treated as ordinary correspondence. "Pastor Maren," the clerk said, and there was a subtle stiffness in his voice that suggested something official. Regulus stood. "Yes?" The clerk approached, holding out a thick envelope. It was made of heavy cream paper, reinforced at the seams, sealed with wax. The stamp was unmistakable. The imperial cross, pressed deep and clean, the edges sharp. Regulus's stomach tightened. Clerk did not meet his eyes. From the palace, sir. Regulus took it slowly, feeling its weight. It was heavier than a normal letter. Too heavy. Thank you, he said. Clerk nodded, backed away, and left without another word, closing the door gently behind him. For a moment, Regulus simply stood there, envelope in hand, listening to the quiet of his office as if it had changed. The imperial seal sat on the flap like a judgment. Regulus returned to his desk and lowered himself into his chair, with the careful movement of a man whose joints protested every sudden motion. He set the envelope down in front of him. He did not open it immediately. He stared at it, as if the paper itself might speak. Over the years, he had received letters from bishops, from governors, from old students now stationed across the empire. He had received requests for counsel, invitations to speak, notifications of deaths. He had read countless official documents. But something from the emperor himself? This was different. This carried the gravity of authority. He slid a small knife from his desk drawer and with a steady hand broke the wax seal. The flap opened with a faint tearing sound. Inside were not one, but several items. A formal letter on thick imperial stationery. A thin stack of type reports clipped together. Small bundle of photographs, grainy, black and white, the edges curled slightly, as if hastily printed. Regulus's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. He unfolded the letter first. The handwriting at the bottom was unmistakable. Firm, restrained, elegant in its simplicity. Edmund Leofric IV. Regulus read. The emperor's words were measured. They did not waste ink. His eyes moved line by line, expression tightening with each sentence. The emperor was appointing him as an ecclesial envoy and assessor. He was to go to the front. Not as a chaplain stationed to a unit. Those were common. But as the emperor's personal ecclesial envoy, an investigator. A man sent to look at reports the imperial cabinet did not understand. To assess them not merely for military consequence, but for spiritual threat. Regulus read the letter again, slower. Sentence near the middle held his attention. You will proceed to the theater of operations and join the assigned security detachment under Sergeant Lewis. You will be assigned to Lieutenant Titus Rendall and his squad. Your purpose is to assess, document, and advise regarding the nature of these occurrences, and the doctrinal and spiritual implications thereof. Regulus stared at the line until the words blurred. Titus Rendall. He knew the name distantly. One of the younger officers. One of those men who came from a good, wealthy family. A man already spoken of in reports with the kind of tone that suggested a competence under fire. Regulus set the letter down gently and reached for the reports. The first page was titled in clean type, Unusual Activity, Levant Region. Confidential. Imperial eyes only. Regulus's mouth went dry. He read. The report was methodical, written in the cold language of military documentation. Multiple incidents of settlements experiencing rapid onset of dense fog or mist, described as unnatural in movement and behavior. Mist reported to move against wind direction and, in some accounts, uphill. Within minutes of mist onset, witnesses report flashes of light. No audible artillery or conventional engagement. After mist dissipates, settlements found with high casualty counts. Bodies present without structural collapse, consistent with bombardment. Medical notes. Wounds described as cauterization, inconsistent with known small arms or explosives. Regulus paused and looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his pulse had quickened. He turned the page. Witness statements were included. Typed, signed, stamped. One from a merchant who had been traveling between towns. He described seeing fog roll down like a living curtain, swallowing houses in moments. He described hearing screams, then silence. Another from a village elder who had survived by being outside the settlement when the mist struck. He returned to find neighbors dead in the street. Skin blackened in strange patterns. Doors open as if people had run out mid-meal. The chaplain's note had been copied for him. The handwriting translated into type, but still carried the cadence of the original voice. This is not like war. This is like a judgment. I have seen the Lord's hand move in mercy and in wrath. And this bears the scent of neither. It bears the scent of an imitation. Regulus swallowed. He turned again. The next section discussed survivors. Or rather, the lack of them. In several incidents, entire towns were wiped out, except for a handful of figures seen moving through the mist in the moments after the flashes. Men, the report called them. But the descriptions were strange. Tall silhouettes, faces obscured, eyes that glowed faintly in aerial photographs. Movement was deliberate and unhurried, as if unafraid of what had just occurred. Regulus's fingers tightened slightly on the paper. He forced himself to keep reading. A new heading. Reports of miracles and prophetic activity. Regulus felt the cold sink deeper. The report listed accounts from refugees and intercepted communications. Stories of healings performed in crescent-held areas by unknown figures described as messengers. A man said to have walked unburned through a house consumed by flame. Water reportedly turned sweet in a contaminated well. prophet speaking in broken Arabic in marketplaces and near mosques, declaring the coming of a God. Not God. A God. A coming deliverer. A new power. A presence that would break the old empires and raise the faithful. The report noted that these proclamations were gaining traction among frightened civilians, especially in regions already destabilized by war. Regulus set the report down and stared at the desk. Outside his office, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Students crossed the quad, bells rang, clerks typed, lectures proceeded. The Empire's intellectual life ran on rails. And yet, in the Levant, something moved through towns like a hand closing around something important. Regulus reached for the photographs. They were grainy, taken from altitude, the perspective angled as if from reconnaissance planes. The first showed a Red Crescent outpost at night. Lights were faint and scattered. Then, almost like a bruise spreading, pale haze rolled over the small buildings. The second showed the same base moments later. Fog everywhere. The lights vanished. The third was worse. Bodies scattered around the base. Shapes scattered like discarded clothing. No crater marks, no collapsed buildings, no signs of a major conflict. An entire garrison wiped out. Regulus leaned back in his chair slowly, feeling the ache in his spine. He had spent years lamenting the apathy of students, years feeling as if his hard labor was poured out meaninglessly. Now the Emperor himself was calling him into the domain of something unknown, to step into a new frontier and bring the light of the gospel with him. Regulus bowed his head, hands folding on the desk. For a moment, he did not pray with words. He simply sat beneath the weight of the task. Then he spoke quietly. "Lord Jesus Christ," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You are king, not only in lectures, books, and pulpits, but in the dust and blood of the earth. You are Lord in the quiet places and in the violent places. If this is a deception, grant me discernment. If this is judgment, grant me mercy. If this is a darkness that seeks to mimic your light, then grant me courage to name it for what it is and expose the wicked." The clock ticked. His breath steadied. He lifted his head and stared at the imperial letter again. The Emperor was not a superstitious man. Regulus knew that from reputation, and from the few times he had seen Edmund speak publicly. Edmund carried faith like a weight, not like a decoration. He prayed, but not for show. He believed, but he also governed. If the Emperor was sending an ecclesial assessor, it meant the cabinet had reached the end of its categories. Regulus rose. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out his Bible. It was worn, leather cracked at the corners, spine softened by years of use. Notes filled its margins in careful handwriting. Bookmarks made of thin ribbon and folded paper protruded from between edges. He ran his finger over the cover. The Word had been his weapon for decades. But it was a weapon of a different kind than the rifles carried at the front. Still, though, it was a weapon. He began to pack with the same careful discipline he had once tried to teach apathetic students. He retrieved a small satchel from behind the desk. Into it went first the Bible, then a notebook of theological notes, his own observations and outlines, pages filled with scripture references and doctrinal summaries. The sort of thing he could not afford to leave behind. He added a small prayer book, a fountain pen, a few sheets of paper. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he took the imperial reports and photographs and placed them carefully in a separate folder, securing them under twine. He sat down once more and drafted a short letter to the Dean of Theology. Not an explanation. There would be no time. Only a notification that he had been called away under imperial authority. He signed it simply, Regulus Maren. Then he stood again and shrugged on his coat. His body felt heavy, but his mind was sharp now. Focus had returned. Not the academic focus of lecture halls, but the kind that came when a man stepped into duty. He left his office and moved through the corridors of New Canterbury. Students passed him without recognizing the gravity of this moment. A few nodded respectfully. One or two greeted him. He returned the greetings with polite brevity, his mind already miles away. He went down the stone steps into the cold winter air. The quad was bright beneath the pale sky. Frost glittered on the grass. A group of students laughed near a bench, their voices light. Regulus watched them for a moment. Young men, unburdened, living as if the world was stable. He wondered how many of them would remain that way. The military vehicle was waiting near the gate. Green, utilitarian, engine idling. The driver stood ready, cap pulled low. Regulus paused briefly at the door and looked back. The stone walls of New Canterbury stood unchanged. The bells would continue ringing. The students would continue attending lectures, half listening, half dreaming of futures that might not come. He felt a strange ache. Not fear exactly, but the sensation of leaving something unfinished. Then he remembered the imperial seal, the photographs, the typed witness statements. He stepped into the vehicle. As the driver pulled away, the academy receded behind them. The road out of the city cut through winter countryside. Bare trees, stone fences, distant smoke from chimneys. Regulus watched it through the window, his reflection faint in the glass. He did not feel heroic. He did not feel afraid. He felt sober. The kind of sobriety that comes when a man realizes his teaching, his theology, his doctrine, his insistence that God governs not only souls but nation, was about to be tested under fire. Hours later, they reached a military airfield. Aircraft sat on the runway, twin-engine transports painted in muted Anglia colors, marked not with modern insignia, but with a green and gold cross. Mechanics moved beneath wings, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines. Soldiers loaded crates and equipment. The world here smelled different. Gasoline, cold metal, canvas, and the sting of exhaust. Regulus climbed into the aircraft, his satchel close. Inside was an airman assigned to his side for the trip. As he entered, the young man saluted, then held up a small handgun, saying, "You may need this." It had been years since he had held a firearm, decades since he had been trained on how to use one. He took it slowly, and the weight of the weapon rested gingerly in his palm. Regulus held it there a moment before quietly slipping it into his bag. The interior was loud, vibrating with engine power. Benches lined the walls, nets hung overhead. As they lifted off, the ground fell away behind them. Regulus looked down at the shrinking world, fields, roads, clusters of buildings. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, lay the Levant. Somewhere beyond that lay the strange mist and the flashes. Somewhere beyond that lay men who called themselves prophets and spoke of a coming God. Regulus's fingers tightened around his Bible. He did not know what awaited them, but he knew what he carried. Not merely paper and ink, but the word of the living God, and the responsibility to name false gods for what they were. The aircraft droned steadily, carrying them toward the front, toward Titus Rendall's unit, toward whatever waited in the fog. The sea had a rhythm of its own. It did not care for flags, hymns, or speeches. It did not care that empires rose and fell along its shores, that men had prayed over maps and stamped orders with wax. It simply moved. Endlessly, inexorably, gray and cold beneath a winter sky. The Anglia carrier Crown of Albion cut through that sea with a steadiness that felt almost arrogant. She was enormous. Her hull a slab of steel that displaced water the way a cathedral displaced the horizon. Her flight deck stretched long and flat, marked with pale lines and numbers that meant life and death to pilots who had memorized them. Planes sat latched in place along the edges. Fighters and bombers, wings folded like sleeping birds. Deck crews moved among them in a practiced choreography. Heads down, hands busy, and bodies braced against the wind. The smell was constant. Fuel, oil, salt, steel, and the faint tang of exhaust that seeped into everything. Commander Hadrian Voss did not go topside. Not yet. He was in the carrier's planning compartment, an interior room deep enough in the ship that the sea became something you felt rather than heard. The room was warm, lit by overhead lamps that cast everything in a hard clarity. No stained glass here. The crown of Albion was not a palace. It was a weapon. A long table dominated the compartment, its surface covered with maps and charts held down by brass weights. An ashtray sat near one corner. A series of clipboards lay stacked neatly beside a thick binder labeled Northern Egypt Landing Operations, Phase 1. On the bulkhead behind the table hung a larger map, pinned and reinforced with metal clips. Coastline rendered in careful lines. Water depths marked, tide patterns indicated. Colored threads and pins traced plan routes like arteries on a surgeon's diagram. 3 men stood over the table. Voss was immaculate as ever. Black and gold uniform pressed in a way that seemed to resist the ship's constant vibration. His gloves were spotless. His posture was perfect. Hands clasped behind his back as he leaned in just enough to study details without appearing casual. His face gave little away, but his eyes moved constantly, scanning, measuring, and predicting. Across from him stood Admiral Edric Sutherland, commander of the carrier task force. Sutherland was a naval man in the purest sense. Weathered face, cigar in his mouth, pale eyes that had seen too many horizons, jaw set by years of decisions made at sea. His uniform was deep blue with gold braids at the cuffs, the fabric slightly worn despite careful maintenance. He smelled faintly of tobacco and salt, even down here beneath the decks. Beside the admiral stood Sir Corwin Ardent, officer in charge of the Marine Brigade assigned to the landing. Corwin looked out of place among sailors, not because his uniform was wrong, but because his presence was too rigid for the fluid world of ships. Where sailors adapted to roll and sway, Corwin resisted it. He stood as if the ship should learn to be still out of respect for him. His eyes were hard, his face was controlled. The same tightness that had marked him on Sicily marked him now. The posture of a man who kept his soul bound in iron bands. The 4th man hovered near the bulkhead, a young lieutenant with a folder pressed to his chest, acting as courier and note-taker. He kept his eyes lowered, ready to move when spoken to, careful not to intrude on the gravity between commanders. Voss's gaze rested on the map. They were close now. Close enough that the shoreline was not just ink and paper. It was a real line on the horizon. A place where men waited with rifles and rockets. Where waves would soon foam around landing craft, where steel would meet sand. The northern Egyptian coast was marked in detail. Towns, dunes, shallow reefs, canal approach routes. The lock stations were noted, along with roads leading inland. The objective was straightforward in the way all objectives were on paper. Secure a beachhead. Establish supply. Push toward the canal arteries. Take the locks and hold them. Then, everything the Empire wanted flowed through. The Admiral tapped a section of the map with a blunt finger. Here, he said, the bombardment line. We bring the cruisers in to this distance. They can hit the shore emplacements, suppress any obvious batteries, and keep the coast free from return fire. Corwin's eyes flicked to the same area. And the Marines land here, he said, tone clipped. First wave, 2 battalions. We take the dunes, clear the first line of structures, secure the road access for armor and supply. Voss listened without interrupting. He already knew these things. He had studied the plans until the lines lived in his mind. He could have traced them in his sleep. But he also knew what the plans did not yet account for. Intelligence had come in from reconnaissance flights and intercepted signals. The Mohammedans, the Red Crescent Republic's forces, were not only dug in with conventional guns, they had set up rocket artillery along the coast. Rocket artillery. It was rather crude compared to naval guns, but it did not need precision to be deadly against ships moving in predictable patterns. A rocket barrage did not have to hit a ship's heart. It only had to hit a deck crowded with aircraft, or strike near a fuel line, or pepper the waterline enough to force damage control and delay. And delay was the enemy of amphibious landings. Voss reached to a smaller set of documents laid beside the map, opened them, and slid a reconnaissance photograph across the table. The photograph is grainy, but the shapes were visible. Long, angled racks half hidden in dunes and scrub, arranged in clusters with ammunition trucks nearby. Thin lines, tracks, showed where the launchers had been repositioned frequently. They were not amateurs. They were being directed by someone who understood modern war. Rocket batteries, Voss said. His voice was calm. It did not rise. It did not dramatize. It simply named the reality of the situation. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. Corwin leaned slightly forward. Sutherland grunted. We've seen the reports. Voss nodded once. Then you understand the problem. Corwin's tone was sharp. They cannot fire if we suppress them. That assumption, Voss replied, is the kind that kills men. The Admiral looked at him, irritation flickering. Watch your tone, Commander. Voss didn't blink. My tone is irrelevant. The batteries are in range of our approach path. They are mobile. They can hide in dunes, reposition, fire, and disappear. Naval bombardment will not reliably eliminate them before we commit landing craft. Corwin's jaw tightened slightly. So what do you propose? Voss's eyes moved to another map sheet, an overlay detailing known enemy air assets. 2 small air bases inland, within sortie range. each capable of sending up a moderate number of fighters and light bombers. Not an air armada, but enough to contest the airspace near the landing corridor, especially if their fighters are concentrated at the right moment. Voss placed a gloved finger on the airbase markings. These airfields. Sutherland's eyes followed. Yes. They will scramble the moment our fleet appears on the horizon, Voss continued. Even if their pilots cannot sink a carrier, they can intercept our strikes and disrupt our schedules. They can force our aircraft into evasive maneuvers. They can bleed our squadrons before the landing even begins. The Admiral's mouth tightened. We're aware. Voss's fingers shifted back to the coastal rocket positions. The rocket batteries are the immediate threat. They cannot be left intact. Corwin crossed his arms. We land under fire, we lose craft. Voss nodded. Correct. And if we delay the landing to bombard longer, Corwin continued, we risk the enemy reinforcing the coast and striking our naval vessels with aircraft. Voss's gaze remained steady. Correct. The Admiral exhaled through his nose. Then what is your solution, Commander? You don't get to list problems without offering remedies. Voss slid another document forward. An airstrike plan, annotated in his handwriting. We strike first, he said. The words landed cleanly, like a gavel. Sutherland stared. Strike first. Before the fleet closes to bombardment line, Voss replied. We launch fighters and bombers now. We hit the rocket emplacements in concentrated waves. We crater the launch sites. Destroy their ammunition trucks. Burn their reload capacity. Force them to relocate under pressure. If they cannot fire effectively during the approach, the landing becomes exponentially smoother. Corwin's eyes sharpened. And the airfields? Voss's tone remained controlled. Secondary targets. If time permits, we hit runway surfaces and fuel depots. But priority is rocket artillery. If the rockets are intact, nothing else matters. Sutherland's gaze hardened. You're proposing to send pilots into contested airspace and territory without any support. Voss looked at him. Yes. The Admiral's jaws worked. We'll lose planes. Yes. We'll lose men, Sutherland snapped, voice rising despite himself. Our pilots aren't ammunition you can spend and replace like shells. Corwin's face remained unreadable, but his posture tensed, as if he felt the argument tighten the room like a rope. Voss did not flinch at the Admiral's outburst. He waited a beat, letting the emotional wave pass, then spoke evenly. Admiral, I am not ignorant of the cost. Sutherland stared at him, eyes bright with anger. Then why speak of it so coldly? Because coldness is clarity, Voss replied. And clarity is what you require when men die either way. The Admiral's nostrils flared. Either way? Yes, Voss said, cutting in with a measured sharpness. Either way, if we do not strike, the rocket batteries will rake our approach. Landing craft will burn. Men will drown in surf and under fire. The Marines will hit the sand already bleeding. Your ships will take damage before they can even perform their mission. Corwin's voice was low. He's right about that. Sutherland looked at Corwin as if betrayed by the ground commander's agreement. Corwin remained resolute. If those rockets are active when we land, the first wave becomes slaughter. The Admiral turned back to Voss. And if we strike first, we gamble our pilots against enemy fighters. Voss nodded. Yes. Sutherland leaned forward, palms pressed to the table. We could wait for naval bombardment. Bring the cruisers in, use their guns to suppress their coastal sites. Voss's eyes were calm. Naval guns cannot reliably hit mobile rocket racks hidden in the dunes. We will waste shells and time is a resource we cannot afford. The Admiral's face darkened. So your answer is to sacrifice pilots. Voss's response came without hesitation. Yes. Sutherland stared at him for a moment longer, as if trying to find humanity in his face and failing. You say that, the Admiral said slowly, as if it cost you nothing. Voss's eyes did not waver. It cost me exactly what it cost you. Sutherland's voice dropped. Do you know any of them? Voss paused for the first time. Not because he was unsettled, but because the question required precision. I know their names, he said. Their squadrons, their commanders, their sortie rates, how many are likely to survive. That's not what I asked, Sutherland said, his voice quiet but grating. Voss held his gaze. I do not make war based on personal familiarity. If I did, I would be useless. Corwin's eyes flicked between them, expression tight as a wire. He understood Voss's logic. He also understood the human cost. The Admiral straightened slowly. His anger did not vanish, but hardened into something more controlled. And if the strike fails, the Admiral asked, if the rockets survive, if the enemy fighters intercept us and we lose a third of our squadrons for nothing. Voss's voice remained level. Then we proceed anyway. But we proceed having attempted the only action that offers a chance at preventing concentrated rocket fire during approach. Not acting guarantees losses. Acting offers the possibility of reducing them. Corwin spoke, voice tight. It's the difference between going into the surf blind and going into it with one threat removed. Sutherland exhaled, looking down at the map as if it were suddenly a grave marker. For a long moment, only the hum of the ship filled the room. A faint vibration ran through the deck with each rotation of the carrier's engines. A constant reminder that they were moving toward a war, whether they wanted to or not. The Admiral lifted his gaze again. Our fighter screens can escort the bombers. Voss nodded. They must, lest we lose every bomber we send up. The Admiral's mouth tightened. You make it sound simple. Corwin's voice cut in. How soon? Voss looked at the clock mounted on the bulkhead. We have a window before dawn shifts fully and visibility increases. The earlier we strike, the greater our chance of hitting emplacements while crews are still in low readiness. Sutherland stared at the clock, too, then back to Voss. You're proposing we launch in the next hour. Yes. The Admiral's jaw tightened. That's fast. Voss did not apologize. Speed wins wars. Ceremony loses them. Sutherland looked down at the table again, then at the plan. His hand hovered over the paper as if it burned. Finally, he said, voice steady. If we launch, we need to coordinate with the cruiser screen to be ready for immediate support. If the enemy responds with aircraft, we might have to adjust formation. Voss nodded. Do so. And if we lose pilots, Sutherland added, quieter now, as if forcing the words through his teeth. Their blood is on all our hands. Voss's gaze was steady. Yes. It always is. Corwin's voice was low. Better pilots than Marines in the surf. The words sounded harsh in the room, but no one contradicted them because every man there knew what the surf meant. Surf meant drowning under fire. Surf meant bodies tangled in wire. Surf meant landing craft turned into coffins. Sutherland's eyes flicked to Corwin. You say that like you don't care. Corwin's face remained carved. I care enough to do what prevents a slaughter. A silence fell again. It was the silence of men who had reached the edge of idealism and stood looking down at the reality beneath it. The Admiral finally straightened fully and looked toward the lieutenant by the bulkhead. Send orders to flight operations, he said. Prepare strike craft, fighters and bombers. Target coastal rocket emplacements immediately. The lieutenant snapped to motion, almost relieved to have a task, and hurried out. Sutherland turned back to Voss. You'll have your strike. Voss inclined his head. Good. The Admiral's eyes narrowed again. Don't mistake agreement for approval, Commander. Voss's voice was quiet. Approval is irrelevant. Sutherland then studied him for a moment, then shook his head faintly, as if the shape of Voss's mind was something he could not fully accept, even while relying on it. Corwin spoke then, breaking the tension. If the rockets are neutralized, my first wave lands with less chaos. That's the difference between a foothold and a graveyard. Sutherland nodded stiffly. I understand. Voss leaned slightly closer to the map again, voice low and precise. Once the strike is underway, we move the fleet into the bombardment line. The Admiral's brows rose. You want to commit the fleet while the strike is ongoing? Yes, Voss said. We do not wait for confirmation. Waiting invites hesitation. Hesitation invites the enemy to reorganize. We move on schedule. If the strike succeeds, We land under reduced fire. If it fails, we land anyways. We do not reveal any indecision. Sutherland frowned. That's risky. Voss's gaze sharpened. Everything here is a risk. We control what variables we can. Corwin's voice was harsh. My brigade needs timing. If the fleet shifts, my craft are delayed, and delayed craft die. Voss nodded once, and the timing will not shift. The Admiral's eyes held him, then flicked away toward the bulkhead where the map and the coastline hung like a verdict. Outside the compartment, the carrier continued to move. Above them, on the deck, crews would be preparing planes now, fueling, arming, checking engines. Young pilots would be tightening straps, pulling on goggles, trying not to think too hard about the fact that they might not return. They would climb into cockpits because orders had been given, because a commander had decided their loss might buy a smoother landing, because war demanded someone to be the one to say yes. Voss felt none of the drama others might attach to that moment. He did not imagine himself as a villain or a hero. He imagined only outcomes. Landing craft intact, Marines pushing inland, locks secured, supply lines established, casualties minimized where possible. However, minimized did not mean eliminated. Sutherland spoke again, voice quieter, less anger now and more weary recognition. You know they'll call you ruthless. Voss did not look up. A victory remains a victory, regardless of ruthlessness. Corwin watched him for a moment, then looked away, jaw tight. Corwin understood, perhaps more than he wanted to. His rigidity was different from Voss's precision, but both men carried a kind of hardness forged by loss. Sutherland turned toward the door. I'll be on the bridge, he said. Voss nodded. I will observe from operations. The Admiral paused at the threshold and looked back once, his eyes narrowing. Commander. Voss met his gaze. Sutherland's voice was low. When you speak of sacrifice, remember those are names. Men with mothers. Men with wives. Men who pray. Voss's face did not soften, but something in his eyes sharpened. Not with emotion, but with a kind of grim acknowledgement. I remember, he said. The Admiral held his gaze a moment longer, then left. Corwin remained, staring down at the map. After a long beat, Corwin said, You really believe it's necessary? Voss's reply was immediate. Yes. I plan wars around real men on real beaches. If that offends you, take it up with the nature of reality. Corwin looked away toward the bulkhead, jaw working. Reality, he muttered, as if the word tasted bitter. It's often a much harsher thing than we would hope. Voss returned his gaze to the map. Your brigade lands. That is the mission. Corwin's voice was strained. And we must remain focused on the mission. Voss nodded. Yes. Corwin stood another moment, then turned sharply and left without further words. His boots striking the deck with the controlled cadence of a man restraining something violent inside him. Voss remained alone with the maps and the plans. Somewhere above, engines would soon roar as aircraft launched into the pale winter sky. Some would not come back. Voss did not allow him to imagine their faces. He did not allow the mind to wander into emotional territory that would blur the math. But he did allow one thought to remain, cold and solid as steel. If he failed, thousands would die. If the rockets fired freely, the sea would become a grave. If pilots died striking those batteries, their death would be a necessary sacrifice for the smooth landing of the larger force. Necessary. The word was not comforting. It was simply true. He gathered the papers into neat stacks, securing them with clips, restoring order to the table the way a man restores order to his mind. Then he turned and stepped out into the carrier's corridors, moving toward operations. The ship thrummed around him, alive with preparation, like a great beast about to lunge. And beyond the hull, beneath the gray winter sky, the coastline waited, armed with rockets and a faith of its own, confident in its defenses, unaware yet of the choice that had been made in dim-lit rooms. The sea rolled on. The Empire moved forward. And the pilots, soon to be airborne, would become the first offering of the day.